4 men were chosen to carry the Holy Ampulla into Reims Cathedral on the day France crowned its king. Not 4 generals, not 4 princes. 4 men the kingdom considered worthy of touching the most sacred object in France on the most sacred day in a generation. One of them was 25 years old, a knight from Brittany who had spent the previous months fighting alongside Joan of Arc at Orléans, at Jargeau, at Patay. The king made him Marshal of France that same afternoon. His name was Gilles de Rais. 11 years later, he was hanged for murdering children. Not one child, not a handful in a moment of madness. The court established at least 100 victims over 8 years. Boys, mostly, taken from the villages around his castles, brought in by servants through side gates, and never seen again. His own confession, given without torture, described what happened to them in the towers of Machecoul in detail that caused the judges to order portions of the transcript stricken from the official record. The same man, the same hands that carried the relic into Reims Cathedral. This is the story of how that is possible, and what was happening inside the towers while the outside world looked elsewhere. Gilles de Rais was born around 1404 into the kind of wealth that medieval France produced only at its apex. Through his father, Guy de Laval, he inherited the barony of Rais, one of the oldest titles in the Duchy of Brittany. Through his mother, Marie de Craon, he stood to inherit vast estates in Anjou and Maine. He had not yet learned to walk before he was already richer than most men he would ever meet. Both his parents were dead by 1415, when Gilles was approximately 10 years old. His mother vanished from the records first, the cause unknown. His father managed to dictate a will, describing himself as suffering from a severe bodily infirmity, and died shortly after. 2 boys, Gilles and his younger brother René, passed into the custody of their maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon. Jean de Craon was, by the consistent verdict of his contemporaries, and every historian who has studied him since, something close to a feudal bandit in aristocratic clothing. When his only son was killed at Agincourt the same year both of Gilles' parents died, Gilles became his sole heir and primary asset. The old man moved immediately. He tried to marry 12-year-old Gilles to a 4-year-old heiress from Normandy. When that failed, he attempted to arrange a match with the niece of the Duke of Brittany. When that failed too, he settled on Catherine de Thouars, a distant cousin of Gilles, brought into the arrangement against her family's will. What Jean de Craon taught his grandson, Gilles described himself at his trial, near the end of his life. His grandfather had given him complete freedom to do as he pleased, and had personally demonstrated that laws applied to other men. The philosopher Georges Bataille, who wrote one of the defining studies of de Rais in the 20th century, put it plainly. Jean de Craon raised his grandson with the certainty that he stood above the rules and that this was correct. By 17, Gilles was at war. France in the 1420s was a kingdom splitting at its seams. English forces and their Burgundian allies held the north, including Paris, while the legitimate heir to the French throne wandered the provinces without a crown or a functioning army. Gilles de Rais fought on the French side, first as the commander of a modest company, then as a lord who fielded several hundred soldiers at his own expense. He was young, reckless, and apparently incapable of fear, either of death or of consequence. In 1427, he stormed the fortress at Gien. In 1428, he fought under the command of the Duchess of Anjou. In April 1429, his name appeared alongside one that would change everything. Joan of Arc arrived in Blois on April 25, 1429, to lead the army marching to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. Gilles de Rais commanded the vanguard of her escort. Several dozen knights and archers he paid from his own treasury. What these two thought of each other is not recoverable. No letters survive, no diaries, no personal accounts from either side. There is only what they did together. On May 6th, Gilles participated in the storming of the Saint-Loup Bastille outside Orléans. On June 12th, the Battle of Jargeau, where the English commander Suffolk was captured. On June 18th, the rout at Patay, where French cavalry shattered an English rearguard that had seemed impregnable. Orléans was free. The army marched north toward Reims. Gilles de Rais rode in the vanguard. In Reims Cathedral on July 17th, the Holy Ampulla, the marshal's baton, the crowd outside the doors. The man at the center of it was 25 years old. He was wealthier than most of the princes of Western Europe. He had just participated in what his contemporaries genuinely believed to be a miracle. Joan of Arc stood a few feet away. In May 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians outside Compiègne. Charles VII did not pay the ransom. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned in Rouen. Gilles de Rais was not at Compiègne. He was not at Rouen. He had already begun withdrawing from active campaigning. His last documented military engagement was the relief of Lagny in 1432, one of his most celebrated feats of arms. After that, he went home. What happened next, historians disagree about. Some argue for a sharp psychological break, that the death of Joan removed the one figure who had given his violence a sacred frame, and that what followed was the implosion of a man who had never learned to exist without war. Others are more measured, pointing out that the gap between Joan's death and the first murders is long enough that something else, the debts, the ruin, the slow unraveling of a man who had always had everything, deserves equal weight. In November 1432, his grandfather, Jean de Craon, died. At the reading of the will, it emerged that the old man had deliberately left his sword and breastplate not to Gilles, but to his younger brother, René. A public humiliation, delivered from beyond the grave by the one person who had raised him. Gilles received the property. He did not receive the respect. After that, the money began to disappear very fast. Gilles de Rais spent on a scale that had no precedent in Western France. He maintained a personal chapel staffed with 25 singers, organists, and priests' investments he designed himself. He commissioned a theatrical spectacle about the liberation of Orléans, 20,000 lines of verse, 140 speaking roles, 500 extras, free wine and food for the spectators. He was nearly bankrupt when he staged it. He had started selling castles years before. By 1435, his brother René and other family members, alarmed by the pace of the liquidation, obtained letters from Charles VII prohibiting Gilles from selling or mortgaging any remaining property. The king's decree stripped him of control over his own estates. He was the Marshal of France, and he could no longer dispose of what was his. It was around this time, by his own account given voluntarily under oath, that the killings began. The first murders occurred at the castle of Champtocé in the spring of 1432 or 1433. No details of those deaths survive. The bodies were destroyed before anyone began asking questions. The center of what followed was Machecoul, his castle in southern Brittany. That was where his servants brought the children, mostly boys between the ages of 7 and 18, drawn from the peasant villages on his lands. The methods of procurement varied. One of his operatives, a woman known in testimony as La Meffraye, the Terror, was specifically deployed into nearby villages. Others used pretexts: carry a message to the castle, help with a load, come inside for food. Some children simply disappeared from the roads near Machecoul while doing ordinary things. An 18-year-old boy last seen playing with a ball of thread near the walls. A 12-year-old apprentice borrowed by one of de Rais's cousins to deliver a message. A 9-year-old tending animals in a field. 2 brothers, 15 and 7, sent to buy bread in Machecoul, who never came home. From the castle, none of them returned. The testimony at the 1440 trial came from 2 of de Rais's closest servants, Poitou and Henriette, his personal valets and principal accomplices. Their accounts matched in details that were difficult to coordinate in advance, specific and technical in the parts where fabrication would have served no purpose. De Rais confirmed their testimony under oath without coercion on October 21st, 1440. He told the court he had confessed enough to hang 10,000 men. In 1438, when the castle of Champtocé had to be transferred to a new owner, de Rais ordered 5 of his servants into the tower to remove the remains of approximately 40 children. The bones were carried out in 3 chests, transported by water to Machecoul, and burned. 2 skeletons were overlooked. When the new occupants took possession of the castle, they found them. The judges who heard the full testimony ordered the most detailed sections stricken from the official record. Those portions were not entered into the transcript. What was entered was considered sufficient. Alongside the killings, Gilles de Rais was pursuing a different solution to his financial ruin. Alchemy in 15th century France was not marginal superstition. It was a serious intellectual system practiced by educated men who believed, with perfectly reasonable logic by the standards of their era, that base metals could be transformed into gold through the right combination of materials and procedure. De Rais hired several practitioners over the years. The most durable was Francesco Prelati, a young Florentine cleric around 22 years old, charming, literate, and skilled at telling patrons what they wanted to hear. In the cellars of Tiffauges Castle, Prelati directed de Rais and his household through rituals intended to summon a demon named Baron. They traced circles with the tip of a sword. They spoke invocations. They waited. The demon did not come. Prelati explained that Baron was displeased and required an offering, specific parts of a child's body presented in a glass vessel. De Rais provided them. The demons still did not come. The court in 1440 treated these episodes with complete seriousness. In the 15th century, an attempt to make a pact with the devil was not a metaphor or a legal fiction. It was a concrete act of heresy against God and the Church, prosecutable and capital. The indictment against de Rais contained 49 articles: heresy, sodomy, murder, demonic invocation, violation of ecclesiastical immunity. For the judges, the heresy charges may have been the graver offense, because the theological hierarchy placed crimes against God above crimes against men, however terrible the men's suffering. Meanwhile, in the villages around Machecoul and Champtocé, the parents of missing children knew, or suspected, what had become of their sons. They said nothing. A shoemaker from Machecoul testified at the trial that families in the area were afraid to speak, knowing that de Rais had a garrison of over 200 armed men, and that crossing him had consequences that did not require a court to enforce. This was not paranoia. It was a correct assessment of the feudal reality in which they lived. The Marshal of France, on his own lands, was the law. What finally broke the silence had nothing to do with the murders. In May 1440, Gilles de Rais quarreled with a family called Le Ferrand over the castle of Saint-Étienne-de-Mer-Morte. The castle had been sold, but de Rais arrived with armed men, stormed the property, and seized Jean Le Ferrand, a priest who had been managing the estate. Kidnapping a cleric was a direct violation of ecclesiastical immunity, one of the most serious legal offenses in Catholic France. Jean Le Ferrand was the brother of a counselor to the Duke of Brittany. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, opened an investigation immediately. It began as a case about the seized priest. It became something else almost at once. Witnesses who had been silent for years began appearing. In July 1440, the bishop published the results of his ecclesiastical inquiry. On September 15th, Gilles de Rais was arrested at Machecoul Castle by a captain of the Duke of Brittany's forces. He surrendered his sword without resistance. The trial ran through October in two simultaneous proceedings, secular and ecclesiastical, in Nantes. Witness after witness came forward from the villages around the de Rais castles. They described specific children with specific names and specific circumstances: a shoemaker's apprentice, a farmer's son, brothers sent for bread. The testimonies went on for weeks, each one adding another name to the list of the dead that no one had dared compile while the Lord was still free. On October 21st, before the court had formally decided whether to apply torture, Gilles de Rais confessed to everything: murder, sodomy, heresy, the invocation of demons. He answered questions about specific victims with specific details. He did not retract. He did not bargain. He said he had confessed enough to hang 10,000 men. The sentence was death by hanging and fire. On October 26th, 1440, Gilles de Rais was hanged in a meadow outside the walls of Nantes, alongside his two valets, Poitou and Henriette, who had been condemned with him. His body was pulled from the flames before it was fully consumed, at the request of 4 noblewomen who had attended the execution. He was buried in the Carmelite church in Nantes, as he had asked. Poitou and Henriette burned completely. Contemporaries recorded that de Rais addressed the crowd from the gallows with what they described as contrite piety, urged his servants to die bravely and think only of their salvation. After the execution, a 3-day fast was observed in the city. Decades later, a tradition emerged in the villages around Nantes in which parents symbolically beat their children on the anniversary of the execution. to impress upon them the gravity of what he had done and what he had repented. The question that historians have returned to with increasing persistence since the 20th century is whether Gilles de Rais was actually guilty, or whether he was the target of a judicial process that served the interests of too many powerful men to be clean. The arguments for doubt are real. The confessions of his servants were obtained under threat of torture. De Rais himself confessed voluntarily, but Poitou and Henriette spoke after that threat had been formally declared. The Duke of Brittany, who organized the arrest, received a portion of the confiscated estates as a direct result of the verdict. The de Rais family, which had stripped Gilles of control over his own property in 1435, had obvious reasons to want him removed permanently. Charles VII, whose throne de Rais had helped defend at Orléans, had long since moved on and made no effort to intervene. In 1992, a group of French historians and lawyers held an unofficial retrial. They acquitted him. Critics dismissed the exercise as a promotional event for a book. Most historians have not accepted the acquittal because the case for guilt does not rest solely on the confessions. It rests on the testimony of dozens of independent witnesses from separate villages describing the disappearance of specific named children in specific documented circumstances, none of them with any connection to each other or any apparent motive to coordinate a false account. It rests on the 40 skeletons in the Tower of Champtocé, which de Rais's own servants removed and burned before the transfer of ownership, an act that makes no sense unless they contained evidence. It rests on the 2 skeletons that weren't removed, which the new occupants found. It rests on Poitou and Henriette's accounts, which were specific and technical in the way that fabricated testimony rarely is. The number of victims will never be known. Most historians place it between 80 and 200. The uncertainty exists because most of the bodies were destroyed. That destruction was not accidental. It was deliberate, methodical, and practiced over 8 years by men who knew what they were hiding. Joan of Arc was formally rehabilitated in 1456, 16 years after de Rais was hanged. Her name was cleared by papal decree. The documents of her rehabilitation do not mention him. The fairy tale of Bluebeard, a rich nobleman who murders his wives and hides their bodies behind a locked door, was published by Charles Perrault in 1697, 2.5 centuries after the trial. Perrault named no sources, but historians who have studied its origins have long noted the concentration of specific details. A wealthy Breton lord, hidden rooms, secret deaths. The name of de Rais was not forgotten in the regions where he had lived. Whether Perrault drew on it directly is unprovable. The resemblance is not subtle. The castle of Machecoul changed hands multiple times after 1440, fell into disrepair over the centuries, and is now a ruin on the edge of a small French town. The site of the execution in Nantes is under ordinary city streets. The villages around his former estates have no particular memory of what happened there in the 1430s. The names of the children who disappeared, the boy with the ball of thread, the brothers sent for bread, the apprentice borrowed by a cousin and never returned, are preserved only in the court transcript of 1440 in the testimony of parents who finally found someone willing to listen. Reims Cathedral still stands. On the afternoon of the coronation, July 17, 1429, after the ceremony was finished and the king had been anointed, and the crowd had dispersed from the cathedral square, Gilles de Rais rode back through the city as Marshal of France. He was at the peak of everything his world could offer a man of his birth. Joan of Arc was alive. The English were retreating. The kingdom was, for the first time in years, beginning to resemble something that could be saved. What he was already thinking, what was already forming beneath the surface of that day, is not recorded anywhere. He left no account of himself from those years. He spoke at length only at the end, in the hall of a Nantes castle, before judges who had already decided what he was. The Holy Ampulla he carried into Reims still exists. It is kept in the cathedral treasury. It has been there for 600 years.